What if the man who played the most loving father on television was hiding one of the most painful private lives in all of Hollywood? What if the woman who stood by his side through his most devastating final days had her own heartbreak that the world never fully understood? This is not just a story about a celebrity death. This is the story of two people. A man who charmed millions of viewers every single week, and the woman who loved him through his darkest hour. And the painful truth about how both of their lives were forever changed. Stay with us, because what happened in those final months will surprise you, move you, and make you see Michael Landon and his wife in a completely different way than you ever have before. Michael Landon was not born with the name the world came to love. He came into this world on October 31st, 1936 in Queens, New York, as a little boy named Eugene Maurice Orowitz. From the very beginning, his life was filled with pain that most people never knew about. His mother, Peggy O'Neill, suffered from very serious mental health problems. As a child, Eugene witnessed things inside his own home that no young boy should ever have to see. His mother made repeated attempts to end her own life, and each time it happened, it left a deeper scar on his heart. He grew up walking on eggshells, always afraid, always unsure of what the next day would bring. School did not offer him any escape either. He was mocked and bullied, partly because of his Jewish background. He had trouble making friends and often felt completely alone. Imagine being a child who cannot feel safe at home and cannot feel accepted at school. That is exactly what Eugene Orowitz lived through, and those wounds stayed with him for the rest of his life. Even decades later, when he was one of the most famous men on American television, people who worked closely with him could sometimes sense that those old scars had never fully healed. Things started to shift when his family moved to California during his teenage years. In California, he discovered sports, and for the first time in his life, he found something that made him feel good about himself. He became an outstanding javelin thrower in high school, so impressive that he earned a scholarship to the University of Southern California. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like athletics might carry him to the Olympics. But that dream was ripped away when a serious injury ended his sports career before it ever really began. It was one more loss in a life that had already seen far too many. After the injury, he was lost. He had no clear path and no money. He took small jobs just to survive while searching for a new direction. Then, slowly, he began moving toward acting. He changed his name from Eugene Orowitz to Michael Landon, and that simple decision marked the start of something remarkable. He auditioned, struggled, and kept pushing forward until a small horror film called I Was a Teenage Werewolf in 1957 gave him his first real taste of attention. It was not a glamorous role, but it opened a door, and Michael Landon walked straight through it. Then came the role that would change everything. In 1959, he was cast as Little Joe Cartwright in the NBC Western series Bonanza. Little Joe was young, handsome, emotional, and full of spirit, and audiences fell in love with him almost immediately. The show became one of the biggest television hits of the entire 1960s. Week after week, millions of American families sat together and watched Michael Landon light up their screens. He went from being a struggling young actor to being one of the most recognized faces in the entire country. But even as the fame grew, something was brewing underneath the surface. He was not satisfied with just performing. He wanted control. He wanted to write, direct, and shape the stories himself. That hunger would define the next chapter of his career. By 1974, Michael Landon had launched what would become his most beloved project. Little House on the Prairie gave him everything he had been reaching for. He starred as Charles Ingalls, a devoted and warm-hearted father living on the American frontier, but he was also the producer, writer, and director behind many of its most powerful episodes. On screen, he was the father every family wished they had. He was gentle, loving, strong, and full of wisdom. Viewers trusted him deeply. For many people watching at home, Michael Landon was not just a television star. He was a symbol of everything good and decent in a family man. The show ran for nearly a decade and found audiences not just across America, but all around the world. It made Michael Landon one of the most powerful and beloved figures in television history. But here is where the story gets complicated, because the man on screen and the man behind the scenes were not always the same person. Those who worked with him described a personality that could be demanding and difficult. He expected perfection from everyone around him, and when he did not get it, the atmosphere on set could become tense and uncomfortable. Some people who worked with him described moments where he humiliated actors in front of the entire crew. Others remembered him as a generous mentor and a loyal friend. Both versions of him were real. That is what made Michael Landon such a complicated and fascinating figure. His personal life was just as complicated. His first marriage, to a woman named Dodie Levy-Fraser in 1956, ended in divorce by 1962. His second marriage, to Marjorie Lynn Noe in 1963, seemed more stable on the surface. Together they built a large family and shared nearly 2 decades together. But behind the walls of that home, the pressures of fame, long work hours, and a lifestyle that Hollywood creates were quietly tearing things apart. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, rumors about his personal life were becoming harder to ignore. The biggest scandal of his life began on the set of Little House on the Prairie, when he fell deeply in love with a young makeup artist named Cindy Clerico. She was significantly younger than him, and the relationship began while he was still married to Marjorie. Word spread quickly among the cast and crew. It became an open secret on the set long before the public knew anything about it. In 1982, his second marriage ended in divorce after nearly 20 years. The news hit his fans hard. The man who played the devoted, faithful father on television had walked away from his own family in a way that shocked people who had admired him for so long. In 1983, Michael Landon married Cindy Clerico. The wedding was covered widely by the press, and the reaction from the public was deeply divided. Some people felt betrayed. Others eventually forgave him and moved on. What is important to understand is that Cindy was not just a scandal. She became his partner, his supporter, and ultimately the person who would hold him together during the most terrifying chapter of his life. And that chapter was coming faster than anyone could have imagined. In early 1991, Michael Landon began feeling something was wrong. He had severe stomach pain that would not go away. He felt exhausted in a way that rest could not fix. He went to the doctors, and what they found destroyed the optimism he had tried to hold on to. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and deadly forms of the disease. Doctors delivered the news that this cancer had already spread significantly inside his body, which meant the options for treatment were extremely limited. For a man who had spent his entire adult life projecting strength and confidence, this diagnosis was a blow that shook everything he believed about himself. Rather than disappearing quietly, Michael Landon chose to face his illness in public. In April 1991, he appeared on television and announced his diagnosis to the world. He sat with reporters and spoke honestly and openly about what he was going through. For the millions of people who had grown up watching him, seeing him in that moment was deeply emotional. The strong, energetic man they had known for decades looked different now. But even in that moment, there was still something powerful about him. He spoke with dignity and without self-pity, and his willingness to talk about pancreatic cancer, a disease most people barely understood at the time, brought enormous attention to the illness and touched people across the country. Now here is what the competitor's story left out, and what makes this story even more heartbreaking. While Michael Landon was fighting for his life, Cindy Clerico Landon was living through her own private nightmare. She had built her entire world around this man. She had given up so much to be with him, had survived the public judgment and the gossip and the criticism, and had finally settled into a life she loved. And now she was watching the person she loved most in the world slip away from her, day by day, faster than anyone had prepared her for. She stayed by his side every single day. She never left. She made sure he was surrounded by love, by family, and by the warmth that he had spent his whole career projecting on screen, but had not always managed to hold on to in real life. His children gathered around him too. In those final weeks, the man who had lived his life surrounded by cameras, crew members, and millions of viewers was now spending his last moments in the quiet of his home in Malibu, California. There were no sets, There were no scripts. There was only the truth of who he was and the people who loved him regardless. The cancer moved through him with terrifying speed. By the summer of 1991, it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done. On July 1, 1991, Michael Landon passed away at the age of just 54 years old. The speed of his death stunned the world. Only a few months had passed between his public announcement and the moment he was gone. Hollywood responded with an outpouring of grief. Tributes filled television screens and newspaper front pages. Colleagues, co-stars, and fans all shared the same feeling of disbelief that someone so full of energy and presence could be taken so quickly. He was laid to rest at Hillside Memorial Park in Los Angeles, in a private ceremony that kept the world's attention at a respectful distance. His family said goodbye away from the spotlight, exactly the way Landon himself would have wanted it in the end. As for Cindy, the woman who had been both celebrated and criticized for her place in his life, she carried the loss in ways that words can barely describe. She had gone from being the young woman the tabloids gossiped about to being the grieving widow who had held a television legend's hand through his final breaths. Life after Michael Landon was a completely different world, and she faced it with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout their time together. Michael Landon's story is not simply the story of a man who rose to fame and then died too young. It is the story of a boy who survived a painful childhood and turned his fear into ambition. It is the story of a man who was deeply flawed and genuinely gifted at the same time. And it is the story of a love that began in controversy but ended in complete devotion. The horrible ending was real. The grief was real. But so was everything he gave to the world in the years before that final summer took him away. If this story moved you and you want to hear more untold stories from the golden age of Hollywood, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.